Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware for the 2013 season. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. Global Agenda is supported by the University of Delaware's Institute for Global Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. Our theme this semester is America's Role in the World. We're exploring the many ways the world expects the United States to get involved, from fighting wars and terrorism to protecting intellectual property and internet freedom, to policing freedom of navigation for the world's oil supplies in the Middle East, to intervening in places like Libya and Syria to try to make peace between Arabs and Israelis. Not to mention U.S. roles in keeping the world economy going and selling weapons to almost anybody who asks. Our guest tonight, Bill Harlow, was the chief spokesman for the Central Intelligence Agency for 7 years. The CIA keeps an eye on just about everything in the world, forecasting threats and spying opportunities for the U.S. He held that top post during the end of the Clinton administration and the start of the Bush II administration, right through the September 11th attacks, the war on terrorism that followed, and the first 2 years of the Iraq invasion by the United States, including the run-up to the war when CIA evidence was used by the White House to justify the invasion. Before joining the CIA, Bill was a career U.S. Navy officer. He served at the White House as an assistant press secretary during the 1980s and early 1990s in the Reagan and Bush I administrations. He's the author of a spy novel called Circle William and has co-authored 2 nonfiction books about the world of intelligence, one of them with former CIA Director George Tenet, and the other about the role of aggressive actions, other people refer to that as torture, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. These days, Bill runs a communication firm called 15 Seconds, which advises corporations, government agencies, and prominent individuals on crisis communication and provides training to help people deal effectively with the media in times of crisis and calm. Bill earned his BA in political science at Villanova and his MS in public relations at American University. Please welcome Bill Harlow to the University of Delaware.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ralph. It's quite an honor to be invited to participate in your Global Agenda program, which over the past decade I know has invited a number of impressive speakers to this stage. And since I'm not nearly as well known as most of those people, I can only attribute the large turnout tonight to the mystique of those 3 words in my former title, 3 letters, CIA. So I thought I'd start tonight by revealing a secret. As a former CIA officer, I can read minds. And when many of you heard that tonight's speaker was a former chief spokesman of the CIA, one thought and only one thought went through your minds. You were thinking, man, that must have been the easiest job in the world. I get that all the time. People think that what I did was to sit around all day and say no comment. And it's understandable that people would think that because you don't often see the CIA spokesman holding press conferences or appearing on television. It's the ultimate low-profile position. Ted Koppel once said that the words CIA public affairs are the ultimate oxymoron. And, in few other jobs you can get a laugh just by telling people what you did. But when I tell people that I was the chief spokesman for a secret organization, it usually they understand it's not a well-traveled path. And frequently, people would ask me questions, and then they'd say, I suppose if you answered that question, you'd have to kill me. And I would get that so much, I finally started saying, no, I wouldn't have to. It's entirely optional. But the disconnect between reality and people's expectations is one of the things I want to talk to you about tonight. About 3 weeks ago, I was watching the confirmation hearing for John Brennan to become the new Director of Central Intelligence. And after an event like that, you frequently hear pundits and other people say, well, he didn't tell me everything I wanted to hear. But what I think when I'm watching that is, it's a miracle that this is happening at all. What other country would have an open public hearing for the head of their secret intelligence service? What other country would put this on television for 4 hours, let lawmakers grill that person, and then eventually vote on whether that person should be the head of their clandestine intelligence agency? And I think the answer to that rhetorical question of what other country is there aren't any others. Even countries that are democracies, that are like ours, the British, for example, are much more circumspect about what they say about their intelligence service. Although it's been around since 1909, the organization, which is now called the British Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, the fictional home of James Bond, the Brits didn't even admit that it existed until 1994, about 90 years after it was started. And the head of that organization, for the first time, made a public speech 2 years ago. So the CIA and the United States, I think, our place in the world, we're much more open than people give us credit for. Now, people in the United States expect there to be a secret intelligence service. They expect to have a CIA. As a superpower, I think they want us to be able to operate on their behalf clandestinely to gather intelligence. They want us to be all-knowing, but they'd like us to reveal to them, whenever they ask, whatever they want to know. And the disconnect, again, between their expectations and aspirations and the confusion about the myth and the mystique of CIA is one of the things that made my job somewhat sporting. Now, as Ralph mentioned, I didn't spend my entire career at the CIA. The first 25 years of my professional life, I was a naval officer. And for many years, the Navy also prided itself in being a little closed-mouthed. The phrases, the silent service and loose lips sink ships come to mind. Now, when I was in the Navy, I made some speeches to audiences there to try to explain how we'd come a long way in our relations with the media. And I used to cite the example of, in World War II, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernie King, was once asked, "What's the Navy's responsibility to the press?" And he thought for a moment, and he said, "When the war is over, we should tell them who won." So I used that example to say, boy, we've come a long way. And a naval historian happened to be in the audience one time, and he came up to me and he said, it's true that the Admiral said that, but did you know that he used to have weekly sessions at his house where he had reporters come over and he'd brief them on the Navy's progress in the war? And I didn't know that, but it's true that he did that, because here was a guy who was maintaining the zip-lipped stance of keeping quiet at all costs, but yet he understood in his heart that the Navy did have a responsibility to communicate to the public within the bounds of secrecy and security, but to communicate to them about its role and its performance. So when I took off my uniform and put on my figurative trench coat on arrival to the CIA in 1997, I knew my job was going to be a little bit more difficult, but I didn't fully understand the challenge. Early in my tenure, I was talking to a group of clandestine service officers, those in the agency who steal the secrets, the spies, basically. And I was explaining to them my theory that while sure there's lots of things that need to be kept secret, there are other things that we should be able to and could be able to say. And I said, we need to be able to do a better job of explaining to the public that CIA officers are patriots, that they share the same goals as everybody else, that they're mothers and fathers, that they're Little League coaches, that they have a firm moral compass, and these are honorable people. One of the people present came up to me and he told me he was appalled by my suggestion. And he said, that message is good for around here, but when I go overseas, it's helpful for people to think that the CIA is made up of tough, ruthless, all-powerful people. So it helps my job for them to think that we're not what we are, those Little League coaches and moms and dads. Well, suffice to say, in the ensuing 7 years, I made him happy by not overachieving and convincing the public that the agency was a bunch of softies. There was a time when you could communicate differently. You could communicate one message to overseas, another message to a domestic audience. But now, with the world being as interconnected as it is, the same message merges, and it's hard to have different messages for different audiences. Now, that exchange with that clandestine service officer was just one of the difficulties that I faced serving in my position. And being a spokesman for any organization, a large organization, is hard, but it's doubly hard at a place like the CIA, where you can't talk about your employees, your budget, your operating locations, or most of all, your successes. But everybody can talk about your failures, and believe me, they really do. Now, despite the caution I got from that clandestine service officer early on, I continued to hold the view that there were things that we could and we should say. That if we declared everything secret, then nothing would be. And if a reporter came to us with something, we were trying to convince them this really is something that shouldn't be reported. If we told them that about everything, we'd have no credibility. When I first got to the agency, they were about to celebrate their 50th anniversary. And as part of the festivities, they'd identified 50 people who had served there over the last half century who were emblematic of everything good about the agency. And these people were called trailblazers, and they were being honored for their service. So I thought, what a great opportunity to tell some of their stories, to get the word out that these people really do great things for America. So I asked, can we declassify some of these stories? They said, you must be new here. I said, no, I explained why I really wanted to do it. And they said, okay, we'll let you tell this one. And they gave me the story of one of the people who had created the agency's credit union. I said, it wasn't exactly what I had in mind. We went back and forth, and finally, eventually, I was authorized to tell one story about a fellow by the name of Tony Mendez, an agency officer who, about 2 decades before, had gone into Tehran and helped 6 Americans escape from the clutches of the Iranians. It was a pretty good story. It got some ink in 1997, but it got considerably more ink recently when it was made into the movie Argo, which some of you may have seen. Ben Affleck plays Tony Mendez, and the film won the Best Picture award this past Sunday at the Oscars. Now, since Hollywood likes to follow success, I'm looking next year for a blockbuster movie about the CIA credit union manager. But more than just pitching stories about good ideas or responding to questions, I believe that we had a positive obligation to share information without being asked when it was important to the American people. My boss, George Tenet, was terrific in that regard. He made sure that I saw the intelligence that I needed to see, that I could sit in the meetings that I wanted to be in on, and he backed me up when I was trying to push the organization to be a bit more forthcoming than it institutionally wanted to be. Now, the nature of intelligence work is such that agencies like the CIA are always going to make mistakes. And the business, as hard as it always was in the past, got harder in the modern environment. During the Cold War, we used to have to keep track of things that were large. Tanks, missiles, armies, warships. Those are things that frequently you would see from space. And there were thousands of people, or tens of thousands of people, who knew about them. So there were lots of places you could go to gather intelligence. But nowadays, our threats are coming from terrorists, cyber terrorists, and the targets are small. We've yet to invent a satellite that can see into somebody's mind, and tracking Soviet armor in the European Fulda Gap is one thing, but tracking a hacker who's working in his mother's basement is entirely different. Now, you add to that the number of people who know about what a terrorist is planning to do is so small, it makes the job doubly hard to try to figure out what's going on, and we make it harder on ourselves by the rules that we impose on ourselves. Now, the perfect example of what I'm talking about is in the world of terrorism. And I want to tell you a few stories about the communications challenges of dealing with terrorism, both before 9/11 and after. Each year, my boss, George Tenet, would testify at length in open session before Congress, before our congressional oversight committees, about the threats to the United States from around the world. These sessions were carried by C-SPAN. Any news organization could cover them and could report on what he said. Tenet could hardly have been more direct when he was talking about the terrorist threat in February 2000, when he said, Osama bin Laden is still foremost among the terrorist threats. He could strike without additional warning. In 2001, he told the Senate, again on live TV, bin Laden is capable of planning multiple attacks with little or no warning. He said that the terrorists were seeking out softer targets to provide opportunities for mass casualties. Pretty stark warnings. And what was the response? Well, one year, I think it was 2000, the assembled senators asked not a single question about al-Qaida. Now, some of them would tell you, well, they saved those questions for the closed, classified hearings that followed. I wouldn't bet on it. But my intent here is not to point fingers. It's not that members of Congress were immune to those warnings, that they didn't care as much as we all do about the threats, but they have a different agenda or a different focus. The year that they asked no questions about terrorism was a year that there had been stories about one of Tenet's predecessors who had mishandled classified information. That story was in the newspapers recently before that, and it was an opportunity for people to score political points. And so they did. They asked questions about that as opposed to the al-Qaida threat. Now, I couldn't help but notice in John Brennan's confirmation hearing about 3 weeks ago, he got questions about things that he might or might not have said a decade ago, about who did or didn't alter talking points that were given to somebody else, not him. And there were almost no questions about North Korea, about Iran, about Syria. And I think that is an important point, is to understand that people chase after the near-term goal and they miss the big picture. And going back to the pre-9/11 period, Tenet was talking about these threats very openly in open public hearings. So you can be assured in the closed sessions and in the classified information, it was much more robust, much more telling. But as far back as 1996, we knew about the formation of an organization by bin Laden and by Ayman Zawahiri that wanted the United States to attack the United States on our soil. We learned that they had been trying to acquire material to use to develop chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons capability. As far back as 1995, the CIA published a national intelligence estimate called the Foreign Terrorist Threat in the United States. And it warned that terrorist targets might include national symbols such as the White House, the Capitol, or symbols of U.S. capitalism such as Wall Street. It said that U.S. civil aviation was an especially vulnerable target. A presidential daily briefing for the President Clinton, December 4th, 1998, was titled, Bin Laden Preparing to Hijack U.S. Aircraft and Other Attacks. But as rich as those warnings were, as frightening as those warnings were, we failed as an agency to collect the secrets that would have told us precisely when, precisely where, precisely how al-Qaida planned to strike. Those secrets were in the heads of a few operatives, and we were unable to find out what they were. It wasn't for a lack of trying, though. By 9/11, we had more than 100 recruited sources inside Afghanistan trying to steal those secrets, but it wasn't enough. Now, the cliche about intelligence analysis is that it's like having to put together a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, but you don't have the box top. Well, if it only were that easy. In fact, it's more like putting together a 1,000,000-piece jigsaw puzzle without the box top and with a couple million of extra pieces from some other puzzle that look like they should fit, but they really don't. So what happens is when something happens, an incident happens, all of a sudden everybody knows what happened. So you basically have the box top. You've got the picture of 9/11. And so people can find little nuggets of evidence, and they hold it up and they say, how could you have missed this? How could you have missed this? Well, the answer is because it was mixed in with those millions of other pieces, and it didn't stand out the way it does today. Now, when the Bush administration came into office in January 2001, the CIA tried hard to get them to understand the magnitude of the threat that was out there. But new administrations, any new administration, finds themselves overwhelmed with lots of information about lots of threats. And what they tend to do, it's hard for them to sort the urgent from the really urgent. July 10th, 2001, there was a flurry of intelligence reporting so troubling that Tenet called the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and he asked to see her immediately. He brought with him the head of the the Counterterrorism Center, Cofer Black, and a couple other officials to try to bring her up to speed. The opening line of their briefing to her was, there will be a significant terrorist attack in the coming weeks or months. They laid out a chart that showed 7 different pieces of intelligence gathered in the previous 24 hours that predicted imminent attack. But not long after that briefing, things got quiet, and we didn't know why. We hoped that we had done something to thwart or delay the attack, but it turns out, we later learned, that al-Qaida was simply waiting patiently. They had on their list of targets the Capitol building in the United States. One of the planes was intended to crash into the Capitol building, and they were waiting for Congress to return from its summer recess. When Congress returned, the attacks were launched. That plane is the one that ended up in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Now, there are very few things in my life of which I was absolutely sure, but on September 11th, I was absolutely sure that this country would never forget how we all felt and the determination that we had to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again. We had watched planes full of innocent men, women, and children being flown into iconic buildings. We'd seen people jumping from the highest floors. We'd seen the devastation at the Pentagon. We saw the towers fall, and we knew that this was something that we never wanted to see happen again. September 11th was clearly the worst day in CIA history because people at the agency felt the responsibility for having failed to collect that intelligence that would have prevented that. But as bad as that day was, September 15th was one of the better days at the agency because that day the agency met with the president at Camp David and presented to him a war plan about how to go after al-Qaida in its stronghold in Afghanistan. A mere handful of CIA officers with unmatched area knowledge, language skills, guts, working with a small number of U.S. Special Forces operators, carried out a plan that resulted in the killing or capturing of the vast majority of al-Qaida leaders. But while that was highly successful, significant elements of al-Qaida got away, including bin Laden, and they ran for cover like ants on a stepped-on anthill. So by the spring of 2002, it was clear that the war of al-Qaida against al-Qaida had shifted, and we were going to have to go after them one by one. And as successful as the other campaign was against the Taliban and al-Qaida, we were going to have to approach it differently. In the debris of some of the places that we overran al-Qaida strongholds, we found fresh evidence of more al-Qaida plots being hatched. There was evidence that they had set up labs to create anthrax, and there were troubling reports, later confirmed, that senior al-Qaida leadership, including bin Laden, had met with rogue Pakistani nuclear scientists, and they were trying to obtain, or perhaps had obtained, fissile material which could be used in a nuclear explosion. The chatter being picked up was of al-Qaeda operatives talking about new, larger, more devastating attacks. Now, throughout this period, we had a continuing communications challenge because we had an obligation to inform the public what we could about what we were doing and what we were finding. And there were some things that they couldn't help but miss when we were raising the security levels. They could see that with their own eyes, and yet we had to not give out information which would be a benefit to the enemy. Then in the spring of 2002, thanks to some extraordinary work by the men and particularly some of the women in the Counterterrorism Center, we were able to capture Abu Zubaydah, who was a terrorist who had intimate knowledge of the organization, structure, and personalities of al-Qaida. Jose Rodriguez, another fellow who I worked with and helped to write a book with earlier, had by this point become the head of the Counterterrorism Center. And in the book, he talks about, for the first time, one of the things that we found when we captured Abu Zubaydah in the house where he was captured, there were videotapes that were pre-taped. These are videotapes where he was celebrating a successful second attack on the United States, which hadn't yet happened. But he had gone to the trouble of taping these things because apparently he thought these successes were imminent. They were going to happen, and they want to be ready with these tapes ready to go. So is there any question why, if you find that in his home where you find this guy, you want to know what else does he know? What's in his mind? What can you do to stop that second attack? But we had some problems. Abu Zubaydah had been wounded, badly wounded in the capture operation, and he might die. And the second problem was that he was in Pakistan. And there were a lot of people in Pakistan who were very close to the Taliban, close to al-Qaeda, were sympathetic to them, and we couldn't be sure that somebody wouldn't either try to help him escape or kill him so that any secrets he had might die with him. So we had to get him out of there. So Jose directed that a secret facility be established outside of Pakistan in another country where we could move Abu Zubaydah and we could interrogate him ourselves away from the public spotlight and try to help him recover his health and then tell us what he knew. We sent a world-class surgeon to that site to help him recover from his wounds. And while he was drifting in and out of consciousness from anesthesia and things like that, he would be asked questions by CIA and FBI officers on the ground, because we wanted to get whatever we could out of him in case he did die. We wanted to salvage what we could. And together, they got some excellent information from him. But as he regained his strength, he also regained his determination not to cooperate and not to share the information that we knew he had. Now, this cooperation or working with the FBI, out of that grew some tension, because the FBI's focus is generally gathering information which can be presented in court to convict somebody of a past crime. The CIA's interest was about gathering information which can prevent some future crime. Agency analysts were certain that Abu Zubaydah had a ton of information in his head, and they just wanted to find out what it was. They couldn't see a ticking time bomb, but you couldn't miss the sound of one. So they determined that they had to find another way of getting this information from him. Because if there had been a second wave of attacks during this period, if Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia had been attacked, agency officers felt that they would have had blood on their hands, and they didn't want to have that responsibility yet again. So Jose asked a contractor who worked for the CIA, who had decades of experience working with the military, to suggest a program that we could use to try to find out whether these terrorists had information and were willing to share it with us. Once they developed a list of techniques, Jose insisted that the Department of Justice bless that list and assure us that it was legal. Now, some of our colleagues were anxious to go, and they said, we can't wait for that. We need to use these techniques now. But Jose said, no, we want to get Department of Justice approval in writing telling us that this is okay. And we got it from Department of Justice. They said the tactics were legal, and quite explicitly they said they were not torture. The tactics have become known as enhanced interrogation techniques, or EITs. And once they were developed, they were briefed to the highest levels of the White House, and they were briefed to the leadership of our congressional oversight committees. Now, some of the leadership of our congressional oversight committees have since that time developed selective amnesia, and they don't really remember it, but fortunately our people took notes, so we know who was there. Once they started using these techniques, results came fairly quickly. Now, despite what you may have heard or what you may have seen, I don't know how many of you have seen Zero Dark 30, but most of the techniques that you'll see in that movie are not what actually happened, and most of the real techniques are essentially fairly mild. They're kind of wimpy. They include things like grabbing the detainee by the collar. That's one of the 10 techniques, grabbing him by the collar, or holding his face with two hands, one hand on either side of his face, and shouting at him. If they went back to Washington and asked for permission in writing, they could get permission to slap the detainee, slap him, but they had to splay their fingers, be below the eye, above the chin, and the fingers were splayed to make sure that it didn't hurt. There was one technique that was not used. We were authorized to put Abu Zubaydah in a box with an insect because we had been told that he was afraid of bugs. But the lawyers said, you have to tell him it's a caterpillar, it can't bite, and it can't sting. We figured, well, at that point, why bother? And besides, it's kind of unfair to the caterpillar. Most of the techniques were essentially bluffs. They were designed to scare the detainee, but not to hurt them. If the detainee continued to resist the techniques, they would escalate up to the most notorious one, waterboarding. Now, contrary again to conventional wisdom, only 3 of the terrorists that we held about 100 terrorists, the CIA did, only 3 of them were ever waterboarded. And despite what you may have heard, those 3 individuals were not subjected to this technique hundreds of times. The CIA Inspector General created a great deal of confusion when he reported that Abu Zubaydah had been waterboarded 83 times. But Abu Zubaydah himself told the International Committee of the Red Cross he had been waterboarded 5 times. And the reason there's the disconnect is because the Inspector General counted every time they tipped a bottle, a plastic water bottle, as 1 time. So 1 tip, 2 tips, it gets to be 83. But it wasn't the 83 times, 83 sessions that people would have you believe. Now, other people will argue, well, I don't care, even if it was just 1 time, that's too much. But before we agreed to use this technique, we had learned that waterboarding was a technique used on U.S. military people, mostly Air Force and naval officers, naval aviators, as part of their training to help them resist if they should ever be captured. Tens of thousands of U.S. military personnel had been waterboarded. Again, only 3 terrorists were waterboarded, but tens of thousands of military personnel. Jose and I were doing an event up in New York this past spring. There were about 50 people in the room, a lot of military people, and there were 6 people in that room who had been waterboarded as part of their training. So twice as many as the terrorists we had waterboarded. Now, critics will say, well, yeah, but there's a difference. The military officers who were waterboarded, they were part of their training. They knew that you weren't trying to hurt them, but these nice terrorists didn't know that you weren't trying to hurt them. Well, I was never waterboarded when I was in the CIA, but I did go through a modified version of POW training, basically, back in the early 70s. And what I can tell you is that my assurance that the trainers were not trying to hurt me disappeared in about the first 5 minutes of the training. Now, after we waterboarded Abu Zubaydah, he thanked us. That's right, he thanked us. He said, Allah doesn't expect us to put up with too much, and once you've met the point where you can't resist anymore, then Allah will forgive you for cooperating, and cooperate he did. He told us we should do this for all the brothers so that they too can feel good about cooperating with us. And none of the terrorists told us everything we wanted to know, but what they told us in many cases was truly amazing. They briefed us in great detail about the organization, the structure, the leadership of al-Qaida. They gave us information that we know helped stop numerous follow-on plots. Among the many other misunderstandings that are out there is that we mistreated these detainees or treated them harshly for a long period of time, for the 3 or 4 years they were in our custody. That's not true at all. At most, the longest anybody was ever subjected to EITs was something under 30 days. Most people, less than 2 weeks, many of them no EITs at all. 70 of the 100 detainees received none, not one. The people who were subjected to it were under our control for 3 or 4 years. So a few weeks of harsh treatment, harsh but not torture, I would argue, and then for 3 years after, they were productive in providing intelligence to us that helped stop other plots. Now, Zero Dark 30, despite the problems, is well worth seeing, but again, much of what they show in the interrogation scenes are simply wrong. They show senior al-Qaeda figures in CIA custody being beaten. They show them being strung up by chains from the ceiling. They show them being led around by dog collars. These things didn't happen. Now, the dog collar thing did happen in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq by junior army personnel who were abusing Iraqi prisoners, but this was not part of an authorized CIA program. Now, in the book that Jose writes, we try to give a glimpse into what some of these terrorists really were like. Abu Zubaydah, despite being a really evil guy, at times could be fairly charming. Another guy who was waterboarded was Nashiri, who was the so-called mastermind of the U.S. coal bombing, and our colleagues described him as the dumbest terrorist they could ever met. And then there was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, who was described as pure evil. He's the guy who came up with the plan for 9/11, and he gleefully told us how he had personally decapitated Wall Street Journal reporter Danny Pearl. KSM was also central to my personal greatest contribution in the war on terror. When he was first captured in 2003, it was a huge deal. He had been nabbed in Pakistan, but the word of that got out very quickly because it was a big hoo-ha when he was captured, and you can't keep that kind of thing quiet for very long. And the media were inflating his importance, or they were describing him as a very suave and debonair person, and they called him the James Bond of al-Qaeda. So I released the photo, which I thought I'd put a more accurate face on KSM, and more than any words that I could ever express, told people what terrorism was really all about. It's not the James Bond of al-Qaeda. It's a guy like this. Now, again, one of the most annoying, troubling myths is that no good came from our interrogation. But all you have to do is look at the 9/11 Commission report. A study by NBC News said that 441 of the 1,700 footnotes in the report came from intelligence gathered from senior al-Qaeda leaders who had been subjected to enhanced interrogation. The vast majority of what we know about al-Qaeda's command structure, who they were, where they came from people who had been subjected to enhanced interrogation. Once KSM became compliant, he told us about a planned second wave of attacks. He said that initially, when he planned 9/11, he wanted to strike the West Coast and the East Coast. But bin Laden ruled that out, said it's too hard, we'll just strike the East Coast. So KSM was planning to go back and carry out the second wave of attacks on the West Coast. He told us that he had authorized one of his subordinates to conduct the training for that. And this was a terrorist who was still on the loose by the name of Hambali. Hambali, we knew, was the guy who was behind the bombing of a nightclub in Bali, which killed 200 people. And KSM told us that he had sent some money to Hambali via a guy called Majid Khan. He gave him $50,000 to Majid Khan for Hambali to train for this second attack. So it turned out we had captured Majid Khan about that time, and we asked him about it. He said, oh, yeah. But he said, I passed that money to another guy in Thailand by the name of Zubair. So we captured Zubair. We asked him about it, and he said, well, yeah, and I gave that money to another guy whose nickname was Lily. So we captured Lily. Lily gave us information which allowed us to capture Hambali. Once we had Hambali in our custody, we asked him about this, and we learned that he would be succeeded probably by his brother, whose nickname was Gun Gun. He gave us information which led us to Gun Gun. He had a cell of 17 people called the Garaba cell, including people who were pilots who were planning on a second wave of attacks. All of this started from the initial conversations, initial interviews with KSM. There are a lot of other examples I could give you, and I won't bore you with them tonight, but for people who say no good comes from these interrogation programs, I would say do the math. In 1998, al-Qaeda attacked 2 U.S. embassies in Africa. 200 people, including 12 Americans, were killed. In 2000, they attacked the USS Cole, nearly sank a $250 million warship, killed 17 American sailors. 2001, 9/11 happened. I don't need to remind you of what happened, all the devastation of that day. And then in 2002 and 3, the CIA used these interrogation techniques on a handful of terrorists. And since that time, there have been no major mass casualty attacks on U.S. interests outside of a war zone. Now, that doesn't mean that we're safe or that things are all clear, can be sounded. Obviously, the attack on the consulate in Benghazi is an example that shows that al-Qaeda and its affiliates are still out there. But the successful attacks on U.S. interests inside our homeland and our embassies abroad, much more reduced following these tactics. Probably the most controversial issue that Zero Dark 30 stirred up was the question of what role, if any, enhanced interrogation played in finding bin Laden. Now, there are some who will tell you it played no role at all. Well, once again, they're just flat wrong. In 2004, we captured a terrorist who was trying to communicate with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the head of al-Qaeda operations in Iraq. Initially, that terrorist wasn't cooperating too much, so after a few and only a few enhanced interrogation techniques, he told us that bin Laden was using a single courier to communicate with his organization. Bin Laden, he said, wasn't using cell phones, it wasn't using radios, it wasn't using the internet, no electronic means of communication. So that told us that it was going to be very hard to find. And he told us the nom de guerre of that terrorist, Ahmed al-Qaida. Now, we'd heard the name before, but not in that context, not in the fact that this was the guy who was dealing with bin Laden. The news that there was a single courier told us that bin Laden was spending a lot of time trying to stay alive and not running the day-to-day operation of the organization. But armed with this one name, al-Qaida, CIA officers went to the other detainees who were in our custody. And when they asked KSM, who by that point was being very cooperative with us, he had us roll a whiteboard into his cell so he could draw diagrams for us of things like, and give us lectures on al-Qaeda. But when they asked him about al-Qaida, he said, do you know anything about this guy? His eyes grew wide. He backed away. He said, no, never heard of him. Now, in poker, I think that's called a tell. Yeah. So, and that brings up another misconception about interrogation. People think, well, if these guys don't tell you everything they know, then the system is a failure. Well, we never expected that they would tell us everything they knew, and we knew that they would try to keep some information, critical information about bin Laden, for example. They would never reveal that intentionally. But by being cooperative with us, we were able to learn much of what we needed to know. We had other tools available to us as well. We had determined that the al-Qaida detainees had a secret communication system set up among themselves. Now, I'm not allowed to tell you exactly what that was, but I can tell you that they were trying to communicate with themselves, and we let them do so because we were intercepting the communications and we knew what they were saying to each other. KSM told the other detainees, do not tell them anything about this courier. Tells us a lot of information about the courier. Now, at that point, years worth of hard intelligence work after that went into finding the courier's true name, tracking him down, and then tracking him to Abbottabad. But the trail to Abbottabad started with these enhanced interrogations. Now, I told you earlier that I was absolutely certain that none of us would ever forget how we felt and our determination to prevent another 9/11 from happening. Well, it turned out that was one of the things that I was wrong about, because people did forget. As time passed, people who had been totally supportive were suddenly saying things like, maybe the threats really weren't that great, or, okay, yeah, maybe you stopped a couple potential plots, but they weren't really close to happening, as if you don't get any credit unless the fuse is right next to the dynamite before you snuff it out. I thought the whole idea was to stop them early on, but and then agency officers started getting second-guessed about what they had done and went under investigation by the Department of Justice. The people on the Capitol Hill who had been supportive suddenly forgot about their support. Now, I'm not saying that everything the agency did was done perfectly, but far from it. We had people who overstepped their bounds, but when we heard about that, we self-reported it to the Inspector General and to the Department of Justice. There was one instance where a guy blew cigar smoke in the face of a detainee, and we reported that to the Department of Justice. Eventually, the Bush administration, Department of Justice, investigated all these reports and elected not to prosecute anybody. The Obama administration came in, reopened a lot of the investigations, but they too have decided not to investigate, not to prosecute anybody. But the pressure on the people who are still trying to do the right thing in the war on terror and find themselves under investigation all the time is quite severe. They're subjected to sort of a double jeopardy, and it's difficult for them to do their jobs and focus on that when they're being chased by investigators. You hear from politicians, do the right thing, do what we ask you to do, we'll have your back. But it turns out that too many politicians learned about intelligence from watching the old TV show Mission Impossible. You remember the part where at the opening there it said, should you be caught, we'll deny any knowledge of your activities. Well, that's the part where they think how you deal with the CIA. But now CIA officers have learned that pledges of undying support last only until memories fade or until there's a new election. But this is a problem because the current president, whoever the president is going to be asking CIA officers to take risks, to do difficult jobs, to do aggressive things to protect the American people. And any president is going to be saying, it's okay, I'm, as your president, asking you to do this. The Attorney General is saying it's okay and legal. Congress is saying it's okay for you to do this. Trust me, it's okay. Well, you'll forgive agency officers if they're a little bit skeptical now about wondering whether those promises will be backed up. In the first couple of years after 9/11, about 3/4 of al-Qaeda's senior leadership were killed or captured. Many of them were captured and are now in Guantanamo Bay. But in the last few years, you'll notice hardly any senior al-Qaeda leaders have been captured. Now, why is that? Well, one theory is that the administration has made it so hard to hold and interrogate prisoners. They've ruled out the black sites where we used to hold people. They ruled out the use of any of these techniques. They've made it so hard to hold anybody or capture them that they default to killing them, to blowing them up with a Hellfire missile. Now, while I support the use of drones as appropriate, it's hard for me to understand why taking 3 of the worst terrorists on the planet and making them uncomfortable for a few days in the first month of their 3 or 4 year incarceration is torture, but blowing up people who are suspected terrorists and people who are sitting around the campfire with them, including potentially some American citizens, that's perfectly fine. Again, memories have faded. People are willing to accept different things. They're saying that the threat isn't all that bad. But I'm saying to you that we did what we were asked to do by our government, and our country is safer as a result. Now, what's the lesson from all of this? The things that I've talked about tonight, many of them are hotly debated. Many people will say they're highly debatable. But I think reasonable people can expect that the CIA, the U.S. government's intelligence service, will do what it can to try to protect the American people. Now, what bothers me is that you can have a different view about the appropriateness of enhanced interrogation or the use of drones or any other technique. But when people divide it up on partisan lines, Democrat and Republican, left and right, and they attribute to the other side of this argument that if you don't agree with me, you must be evil, corrupt, immoral, or stupid, it seems to me that's contrary to our public interest. Now, the CIA, again, has been far from perfect in doing what it does, but it has an essential mission. I think the American people expect the agency to protect the lives of American people. They want us to protect American men and women in uniform, to ensure that they dominate on the battlefield if they have to be called on to deploy. They want the agency to protect Americans from terrorists, from cyber terrorists, drug traffickers, weapons of mass destruction. They want intelligence to arm our diplomats with critical insights and foreknowledge so they can help them advance American interest. And they want the agency to focus not just on threats, but on opportunities to act before danger becomes disaster, and opportunities to create favorable situations for American interest. And they want CIA's reporting and analysis to add real value to what's already known about the toughest problems facing the country. America's role in the world, to my mind, is to be strong, to stand up against those who explore evil, to do all we can to defend which is good. And in my remarks tonight, I touched on just a few of these topics, and I'm sure there's many other areas that you'd like to talk about, and any that I've omitted is not because I'm trying to duck them, but because of interest of time. I'd like to hear your thoughts, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. You talked a lot, obviously, about al-Qaida and about the agency's work in uncovering its leadership and bringing them to justice, or at least capturing them. What about, is the agency, and you also mentioned that sometimes we are not looking at the big picture, that we look for the small things, we focus on small things, and we miss the big picture. Is the agency, and maybe more broadly the United States, missing some other big picture with our intense focus on the al-Qaida threat? Is it, or would you say, I mean, I know you didn't speak about everything the agency does, so, but is the agency, do you believe, sufficiently paying attention to other threats?
It's difficult to do because you worry about the wolves nearest the sled. And now people are worried about terrorism and al-Qaida, and perhaps starting to worry more about cyber terrorism, which I think is potentially the next big disastrous situation which might hit us. There's also the larger picture of Middle East unrest and what can be done. Can we do something to harness the Arab Spring to cause democracy to bloom, to prevent people from hating us and coming after us and causing all these problems? There are a lot of things, but a great country needs to do lots of things at once. You can't do either counterterrorism or counter-narcotics or counter anything else at the exclusion of everything else. But I think the American public needs to expect their congressional overseers and the politicians and the administration to be alert to these things. They should look to the worldwide threat briefing that the CIA director gives every year. I'm sure there'll be a new one coming up soon, to look in that about what are they saying about the threat for Syria. Is there something that the United States can and should do? What are they saying about Iran? How much do we know? Can we know more? Should we know more? It's not a simple either-or question. That we need to do a lot of things all at once.
Do you think other countries are out there, or perhaps other threats, maybe not countries necessarily, who are saying, aha, the Americans are all focused on al-Qaida right now. Here's our opportunity to get away with fill in the blank?
Well, I suspect that they probably aren't thinking of it quite that way, but they look for the opportunity to get away with whatever they can, to fly under the radar, to do what they can to promote their own interests. Every country's got their own interest. And there is a danger that we focus solely on one thing or another. But I assure you that whoever the new CIA director is, they're going to have their hands full with a lot of things. And hopefully they'll be up to the job to keep a focus on not only the near-term threats, but the ones just over the horizon.
Do other countries depend on the United States and the CIA in particular to protect themselves? You spoke at the end about how the CIA's mission is to protect Americans.
Right.
Of course, it's the foremost mission. But are we, in effect, providing a service to other countries with the activities of the CIA in ferreting out threats not only to the U.S., but perhaps to others?
Sure. We provide a wealth of information to other nations on a partnership basis many times. We provide information to them because we have mutual interest in their security and safety as well. The global economy is such that you can't allow one nation to be disrupted and not expected to have a ripple effect elsewhere. So it's in our own interest to provide information. In return, we get support from friendly foreign nations and sometimes not so friendly nations who have it in their interest to support us, provide information because it does something to deal with a problem that they have in their own backyard.
Now, I know you're not the CIA director, and you never were. And as you just mentioned a moment ago, again, the CIA director does an annual testimony at which there's kind of a broad overview of threats. Aside from al-Qaida, which you spent a lot of time on, what would you say are the next top 3 or 4 threats that the United States needs to worry about in the near-term future?
I think cyber terrorism, because it can be done by a relatively few number of people, it can have enormous impact on us. We're extremely vulnerable. There are a lot of reasons why the private sector can be attacked, and they are unwilling to do all that they can do to protect themselves. They don't want to talk about it when they've been attacked. You've seen recently stories where the New York Times and other papers have been hacked, but it's just as easy to hack into the financial institutions perhaps, or in the power grid or things like that. So there's an enormous vulnerability there. That's sort of the non-state actor threat on the horizon. And then there's the usual assortment of issues, the threats from Iran, from Syria, from North Korea. Each has a different tenor to it, but each could potentially be a huge problem for us on very short notice.
All right. Time for your questions, and as is traditional in Global Agenda, I'll alternate between questions from students and questions from non-students. So we'll start first with a question from a student. Is there a question from a student? Yes, sir.
You mentioned cyber terrorism being kind of the next threat on the horizon. A lot of ideas for how to deal with that have been discussed, from a civilian center to Air Force MAGCOM totally dedicated to it. What would you say would be a likely course or responsible course in kind of centralizing the effort?
Okay, question is about cyber terrorism, which you've mentioned. Do you have any suggestions for how to consolidate the U.S. response to the possibility of cyber terrorism?
The smartest people in the U.S. government are working on that, and I am not one of them. It's a huge problem, and it gets into issues of privacy, and do you want the U.S. military doing things that will intercept electronic communications that come into the United States because of the interconnectivity of everything? It's very difficult to make things foreign and domestic anymore. How you do that, to what extent you have the private sector working on it, very complex situation, and I wish those who deal with it luck, but I'm not able to give you a brilliant solution at the moment.
Is it a de facto assumption that it would have to be the U.S. military that responds to a cyber threat? If so, is it because the military in the U.S. is the only government agency that has the resources to do it, or is it possible that some other, I mean, you talked about the fact that cyber threats come from small operations, sometimes as small as one or two people working together. Isn't it possible that you don't necessarily need the resources of the U.S. military to deal with that threat?
Well, the military can bring to a problem the size of the response. Even though the threat may be coming from an individual or a handful of individuals, it also may be coming from a state actor. And you probably won't know when the threats come in, whether it's coming from somebody in their mom's basement or the Chinese intelligence service, which has a huge structure to do this. So I think the military is best equipped. They've got the most people to deal with this threat. You may have to find legal ways to allow them to act on threats which turn out to be purely domestic, but that's a legal issue. I think you can bring into the equation the capabilities of the private sector, but nobody can match the military's current computing power and assets ready to throw to it.
I'm going to pick up on your concept that applying these things domestically might be a legal issue. The CIA doesn't operate domestically or isn't supposed to operate domestically. And we have a question from a viewer on Second Life who is asking about your defense of the enhanced interrogation techniques against al-Qaida threats, and asking if those techniques were so effective, as you demonstrated they were in the view of the CIA, against international threats, why doesn't the United States, or shouldn't the United States, use them domestically against domestic threats?
Totally different situation. Al-Qaida was a foreign group planning to conduct mass casualty attacks on the United States, killing thousands and thousands of Americans. If you have domestic situation here, who would this person suggest we use it on?
If we had known about Timothy McVeigh before the Oklahoma City bombing...
If you have Timothy McVeigh in your custody, then he's in your custody. He's not a network of hundreds or thousands of terrorists planning to conduct attack. He's one or two lone nuts, and you've got him domestically controlled. You can handle that situation. Totally different when there's an unknown number of terrorist operatives around the world who may attack you here, who may attack you overseas, who may have already people inside the United States. So while you have them overseas, their counterparts are here. Totally different situation. And again, remember that we only use these techniques in the rarest circumstances. Most people would tell you President Obama ended waterboarding. I mean, that's what everybody knows, right? He ended it, right? The last person waterboarded was waterboarded in 2003 when Barack Obama was in the state Senate of Illinois. We stopped waterboarding people because we didn't need to anymore. We did it against the most senior al-Qaeda operatives when we needed to get information from them. And when they became cooperative, we didn't, again, need to use it. We didn't have other people who rose to that level. Those other people cooperated at an earlier state or didn't rise to the level of needing that kind of attention devoted to them. So we didn't go into this in some haphazard fashion. We didn't go into it, just let's do it to everybody and see what we get out of them. It was only in the rarest of circumstances, and it was necessary, it was legal, and it was highly productive in my view.
Okay, question from a non-student. Yes, sir. Okay. Question is, does the United States still have an intelligence czar, someone who's supposedly connecting the communication and the operations among all of the U.S. intelligence agencies? And I think there's something like 17 different U.S. intelligence agencies. And the last part of the question was, will the sequestration cuts that are coming up on Friday affect that kind of coordination?
Yes, the Director of National Intelligence was established in, I believe, 2004, or was announced, probably first established in 2005, and it grew out of the problems that came out of 9/11, but also it grew out of the presidential election. The Democratic side proposed establishing some kind of intelligence czar and not wanting to be left behind. The Bush administration sort of matched them, and they announced the creation of this organization. It was supposedly going to be just a small number of people who would sit above the intelligence community and coordinate and supervise and make sure that information was shared, but it was just a handful of people. Last I heard, it was the headquarters had about 1,200 people in it, giant bureaucracy, and they spend most of their time asking questions of those 17 agencies, creating work for the other agencies. So before that, there was the director of Central Intelligence was also the head of the intelligence community, and one person was trying to coordinate all that. You could argue that it was too big a job for one person, but I think it's not necessarily a job for 1,200 people, and so I'm not sure that added to anything. That being said, the U.S. government almost never undoes creation of an organization. I think the Interstate Commerce Commission went away. Maybe you might want to check me on that, but once an organization gets created, it almost lasts forever, sequestration or not, so you have to work with it. Cooperation is much better, from all I know, between the intelligence services, the FBI, CIA. They created a national counterterrorism center, which does different things than the counterterrorism center, just to confuse people. But the NCTC makes sure that information is fed from one organization to another that needs it, and that's much better. As far as sequestration, I'm sure that will impact the intelligence community like every other part of government. Just about, it was a move that was so stupid that it was designed that clearly we'll never do this. We'll put this draconian X-cutting, budget-cutting system in because it's so dumb that people will come to their senses, and 48 hours or so from now, we probably won't come to their senses, and they'll make these Meat Act cuts to the budget without paying a lot of attention to what needs to be cut and what doesn't, so it won't be a good day for us, for the country as a whole.
A question from a student. Question from a student? Yes.
Thank you for your service and for protecting this nation. I have one major question which goes back to not the CIA's operations in the last decade since 9/11, but it goes back to 3 or 4 decades ago. The CIA murdered Patrice Labomba. The CIA murdered Che Guevara. The CIA brought down the democratically elected government of Arbenz, Mossadegh, and Allende. Can you tell me why the CIA did that, and was that good for our nation?
Okay, questions about the assassinations allegedly conducted by the CIA and other intelligence agencies in the 50s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s. I don't know whether you want to comment on that or to the extent you want to comment on that.
Start with, they were all before my watch, but I can tell you that whatever the CIA does along lines of dealing with foreign governments is done at the request and the direction of the President of the United States. It's done with covert action findings signed by the President, directing them to do it because the President of the United States believes these things to be necessary for the protection of the United States. If there's a covert action finding that is presented to the United States Congress, they're briefed on it within hours or days of its being signed. They have the opportunity to intervene if they think those actions are inappropriate or incorrect. I'm not a historian, but I suspect that some of the things that you suggested the agency did, perhaps it didn't do. One of the things about the agency is you get accused of all manner of things. Some of them may be true, others I know in recent history clearly are untrue, and it's a little bit difficult to sort them out and to talk about them. I can only deal directly with the period that I was there, but again, what the agency does is done with the direction and authority of the President of the United States. So if you have a concern about that or an objection to it, the way to handle that is through the electoral process and elect presidents who won't do those kind of things, authorize the kind of things that you don't want authorized.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like to ask it anyway. The most recent episodes of assassinations are ones that were conducted using unmanned or pilotless drones. Is that true for those operations as well, that the President of the United States authorizes each one of those instances?
The drone program, I think, is officially the world's worst kept secret. However, it is technically still something which the U.S. government, if there were a drone program operated by the CIA, it would be one which I would not be authorized to talk about. There are other drone programs operated by the military which don't fall under that umbrella. But hypothetically, let's say that there were such a program.
Let's say that al-Awlaki had been killed in Yemen.
Hypothetically, should that have happened, it would only have happened under the authority of the President of the United States authorizing it to be done. Not necessarily mission by mission, but generally described as what the agency is allowed to do, where they're allowed to do it, what the standards are for doing it. It's very carefully controlled. Now, you can argue whether they use those techniques too much, whether they should use them at all. That's a debate that people can have. But again, the agency doesn't just pick it up on its own. We think we should go do this and go do it. It's done with the authority, the direction of the President of the United States.
Other countries often have, in the past, copied U.S. techniques. Sometimes it's technology that they discover how to use it as a result of the U.S. using it. Are we heading into an era when a variety of countries will be able to use pilotless drones to make attacks outside their own borders, inside the borders of other countries? And what, if anything, are we doing to protect the American people against drone attacks conducted by others?
Well, technically, I mean, the technical capability of doing it, yes, I think a lot of other states could do it, and wouldn't be that hard to do given the technology today. Whether they will do it or not, I don't know. The United States has a fairly robust defense against air attacks on the United States, and I think anybody who would try to conduct such an attack in the United States from a foreign country, would have to think twice about the wisdom of doing that, because our capability of responding would be pretty massive. But can individuals do it? Individuals can do whatever their mind allows them to conceive of. But again, hypothetically, if we were to have a program like this where we're doing it, we would go after only those people who are the worst terrorists in the world, who are trying to kill American people. Again, we're not perfect at it. Sometimes when the United States takes action, innocent people are injured or killed. When that happens, that is a tragedy. When al-Qaida acts and innocent people are killed, that's precisely what they want.
Okay, question from a non-student? Yes, in the back here.
What was the mood of the agency with regard to the outing by the Bush-Cheney administration of the Delaware plane crash?
Okay, question is what is about the mood at the agency, and you were there at the time when a CIA agent was identified publicly, Valerie Plame. We don't need to go into all the background of how that happened or whatever, but the question is about the mood at the agency.
I was right in the middle of that, and I can only tell you what I told the grand jury, and I was not a target, but the mood of the agency is always one of anger. If anybody who is undercover legitimately has their cover blown, or if any secret which is legitimately secret is revealed. So people weren't happy about that. How it went down, how it happened that her name came out, would be the subject of another 40-minute speech in a very complex situation. And I was right in the middle of it. I was the guy who Bob Novak called on my busiest day elsewhere at the agency and said, "Oh, by the way, I understand that the real story behind Joe Wilson going to Niger is that his wife works out there." And there's a long story about how I tried to dance around it because I didn't want to confirm over an open phone line classified information, and I wasn't sure at that point myself whether she was undercover, though I thought she might be. Later turned out she was. Called Novak back and urged him not to report it without confirming it, but I was trying to get him to not report it. He never told me he was going to report it, and it was probably miscommunication. He's probably asked by lots of other was asked by lots of other spokesmen not to report stuff on political nature. He gets it all the time, and he kind of blew it off. I rarely asked reporters not to report stuff unless I thought it was seriously, and I'm not sure he was picking up on my meaning. Whether the people who leaked that information knew what they were doing is another open question. I'm not sure at all that the people who put out the fact that Valerie Plame Wilson worked at the agency knew she was undercover, because there are a lot of people at the agency who are not. Most of the people you'll run into in Washington, if they tell you they work at the CIA, they're analysts or they're other support personnel, and they're not undercover. So there are people who openly tell you they worked at the CIA. I could tell people I worked at the CIA. So the fact that they associated her with it, they may not have known what they were doing. Once they put that information out there and all of a sudden it became under investigation, then the cover-up got to be worse than the crime, where people, I think, were backpedaling. The first guy who put out the information about her was Rich Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State, and you'll notice he was never prosecuted because he admitted it. When investigators came to him, he said, yeah, I did it. I didn't know she was undercover. Oops, I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Other people took a different approach, and that's why there were prosecutions and things like that involved. Long story, but that's that. And the mood of the agency, they weren't happy about it at all, and they worried about what does that mean for the rest of us. So it was a genuine concern.
We have another question from Second Life that goes back to the cyber warfare topic, which is, I guess, on a lot of people's minds naturally.
And appropriately coming in
over the internet, right.
From China or?
Let's see. Doesn't identify where the viewer is.
Wouldn't be telling you the truth anyway.
That question on. But the question boils down to this. You spoke about cyber warfare as though it were a one-way street. That is, it's warfare against the United States from exterior threats against which the United States has to defend itself. And the question is the United States engaged in cyber warfare against China or anyone else?
Well, you had last year General Hayden here, who had been both head of the CIA and head of the NSA, and I think he got a question along those lines, and I would like to associate myself with General Hayden's answer, which I wish I could remember exactly, but it was something like, well, you have to expect that we would have the capability of doing some things if we need to protect our interest. What the United States will not do is we don't go after people's economy. We don't steal information for the benefit of our industries. We won't steal car designs from Honda and give them to Ford. We won't tinker with turning lights on and off. But if we went into a war with a foreign country and we had the capability of taking action against them, you would have to assume that action would go beyond just the traditional bullets and bombs and guns and things like that, and we would use other techniques to stop them from achieving their war aims and helping us achieve ours.
Okay. Question from a student. Yes, back here.
Hi. There's a lot of criticism of former Director Tenet as being a sort of politicized CIA director, and you mentioned the hearings of John Brennan Report being confirmed in sort of very political nature. I was wondering, is it possible for a director of an intelligence agency with a very apolitical goal of protecting the country to sort of go about that in a non-political way, even though it's always going to be constantly influenced by the media and the public and the current administration?
Okay, question was started off with a reference to your former boss, Director Tenet of the CIA, as the questioner suggested that Mr. Tenet has been accused of being a politicized director of the CIA. But the gist of the question is, can any CIA director operate in an apolitical manner in the atmosphere and under the bureaucracy the United States has now with regard to intelligence?
Well, let me start with the defense of my old boss, George Tenet, who was appointed to his job by Bill Clinton. And he was Bill Clinton's CIA director. And then when George W. Bush came in, the story goes that George W. Bush checked with George Herbert Walker Bush, who, in addition to being a former president, was a former CIA director. George Herbert Walker Bush had offered to stay in his job at the end of the Ford administration. He was willing to stay on to help out the new Carter administration, and Jimmy Carter said no, And so Bush had nothing to do but to go out and run for president and vice president and win. But that is an example of he was willing to serve two administrations and could have done so ably. Tenet, I think, served two administrations, and the notion that he would be skewing his information to please the Republicans, I think, is wrong-headed, considering that he served both administrations. Excuse me. You do have to respond to whoever your boss is and provide information to them that is responsive to their questions, but you don't have to tailor it to what they want to hear. And despite the criticism, I don't think that the agency under Tenet did that. Now, John Brennan, who's a friend of mine and worked at the agency when I was there, has for the last 4 years served at the White House, and if he's confirmed by the Senate, will come back to the agency. I think it's a good thing that the president, any president, knows, trusts, and likes his CIA director, because it's a very important relationship and you can serve him. But it's also important that the CIA director, whoever that is, doesn't tell the president what he wants to hear, but what he needs to hear.
Okay, I don't want to pretend to put myself into your head, so I'm not sure that what I'm about to ask was in your head, but I do want to follow up on that. You answered the question about politicization in terms of serving two presidents of different political parties in two instances, and that's a legitimate response, of course. But there's another way to look at politicization, and it came up in connection with the evidence used to justify the invasion of Iraq. And that had nothing to do with, one president said A and the other president said B, and the director responded one way or the other. It had to do with the kind of political pressure that comes from elected leaders of any political party at a time when they've chosen a policy and are asking the CIA to provide support for their policy. That's the kind of politicization that's different from the kind that relates to political parties. Can you respond to the questioner in that arena? Is there too much opportunity in our political system for elected leaders to demand that the CIA provide not impartial information, but information that supports a specific policy?
Well, I would argue that that's not what happened. I mean, they certainly wanted information that supported their policy, but they asked us for information connecting al-Qaida and Iraq, and we told them no. We could find no evidence of authority and direction and control from Iraq into al-Qaida. And as much as they wanted that, because if they could point out an example of Iraq being involved with 9/11, it would be game over. Everybody would be supportive of going after Saddam Hussein. But we told them no. They asked for information about WMD, and we provided them information which told them that we thought that Saddam did have WMD.
WMD is weapons of mass destruction.
Sorry.
For some people who might not know that.
But why did we think that? Well, every intelligence service on the planet thought that. I would argue, including Saddam's. And if, they'd say, well, I don't have it in my unit, but, the next guy over might have had it. That was a unique circumstance. We were accustomed to countries that pretended not to have WMD programs, but this was a situation, as it turned out, where Saddam was sending signals, inadvertently perhaps, to suggest that he did have a program when he actually didn't. His audience was the Iranians. He was trying to convince them that he was the meanest guy on the block. And so while they were publicly saying to us, oh, we don't have it, they were taking lots of actions that implied that maybe they did. For a variety of reasons, there were lots of bad tradecraft, there were lots of bad decisions, lots of things that went wrong, and I don't mean to defend it at all. There are explanations but no excuses for how the agency got that so badly wrong. But we weren't changing our advice because this is what they wanted to hear. This was information that we truly believed. Badly done, but we truly believed it. There's a story, I think it's true, that CIA officers who were briefing President Obama on whether we thought bin Laden was in Abbottabad said, we're pretty sure he's there, but we were much more sure that there was WMD in Iraq. We were right on one and wrong on the other, and so it's an interesting example of how there is no certainty in these things.
Okay, question from a non-student. Yes, sir.
Seems like there's an awful lot of moral compass spinning going on in that. I look at somebody like Melissa Hazley and what came out of her book.
Do you have a question?
It seems to be that the spinning in there is debating all the time on where the morals are. Is it morals on killing, morals on sex, morals on just about everything?
Okay, so I'll rephrase the question this way and say, does the CIA have a moral compass?
Yes, because the CIA is made up of Americans, just like you. You know, I mean, the people there, you know, back to my, you know, their moms and pops. Yes, I mean, they're just like the rest of us. They do things for the interest of the United States. You know, do they sometimes do things which cause the death of people? Yes, and so does the Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Army. But, you know, do they do things just for the heck of it because they enjoy mistreating prisoners or because they enjoy stirring up hate and discontent in the world? No, not at all. And the agency is one of the most regulated, supervised organizations in the U.S. government. There are more people looking over the agency's shoulder than you can even imagine. And so if it goes off course, there are plenty of people who will try to yank it back onto course. So yeah, it has a moral compass and it follows it. If the agency does something or some part of the government does something that you don't disagree with, everyone will say, well, you've lost your moral compass. Well, some of the senators who are now saying the agency lost their moral compass, the exact same people were telling us in 2002, you're doing what? That's not enough. If my constituents knew that you were only doing that, they'd be outraged. I want you to go out there and take every risk, do what you have to do. And now they're saying, you guys have lost your compass. So, you know, it's a tough position to be in when you're the person out there in the woods, you know, with that compass trying to find your way out of it. But I think that the agency performs its role as well as it can, and that's because the people who make it up are people like you.
A question from a student? Question from a student? No? Question from a non-student? Oh, wait, is there a student? Sorry. Go ahead. Are you asking whether personnel at the CIA know specifically who the enemy is, or are you asking why the CIA doesn't talk about that publicly?
No, are they getting the information they need and it's clearly being offered to the agency?
Okay, so the question is, do the officers and analysts of the CIA have very specific information about who the enemy is, who are the cyber terrorists, who are the al-Qaida operatives, who are the people in Iran who may be building nuclear weapons, or any other threats you may choose to focus on? Do you think you're getting the real stuff inside the CIA?
Well, you know, to the extent that you can. A lot, you know, prior to 9/11, you know, we knew Osama bin Laden, we knew Abu Zubaydah's name, we knew Zawahiri's name, we knew a dozen or several dozen names of people. We didn't know the names of the hijackers, with the exception of actually there was two that we did, which is another long story. But we didn't know that they were going to do what they were going to do. On a broader scale, do we know other terrorist organizations? Yes, we know some people in those organizations. Very hard to know who's actually in the organization and who's not. If you go back to al-Qaida, Abu Zubaydah and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had never sworn bayat, allegiance to al-Qaida. So technically, they were not card-carrying members of al-Qaida, but KSM was the guy who invented 9/11. So clearly, he was the enemy.
The questioner was making reference to a PC environment, politically correct environment. Inside the CIA, are people politically correct about tiptoeing about fingering the enemies?
No, I don't think so at all. But it all depends on how you define PC. I mean, John Brennan has gotten himself into trouble, or people have gone after him because he's tried to make the point, in his view, you shouldn't use the word jihad or jihadis because there are many Muslims who think of the word as a holy struggle, not against the United States, not against Christians or Jews, but to struggle to be better, or struggle to achieve, struggle to. So, I mean, John is an Arabic speaker and a student of these matters, and in his estimation, you shouldn't call them jihadis because by doing so, you're lumping into the group of enemies some people who are not enemies. So it's not political correctness. It's, in his view, I would think, political accuracy of trying to define it that way. Now, if you want to, look at it from the others, you can say, well, he's shying away from the term, but he's got no problem in naming those people who we know, are inspired by al-Qaida as enemies of the United States. And as you can see, they have no problem trying to kill them. So that's not exactly, politically correct. But the language of how you label it is another issue. Also, there's a big debate over whether you want to say the war on terrorism. And because people will say, well, terrorism is a technique, it's a tactic. It's not an army that you can go after. So you shouldn't be having a war on terrorism. You should be going after proponents of terrorism, people who use it, but it's a different title. But they haven't come up with a very good title yet. So any of you political science students who want to come up with one, you have a future in government. If you can put a label on it that will be more accurate and confine it to what it really is without expanding beyond those boundaries.
All right, I'm going to take one more question from a non-student. Ma'am, in the back.
On cyber terrorism, you said that there's a bit of a reluctance by financial institutions and other businesses to prepare themselves for this upcoming threat. Does the agency or others secret service type agencies have, intelligence agencies have an understanding of why the private businesses are reluctant to prepare themselves? And does the agency believe that they are not going to be able to counteract this cyber terrorism without using private business?
Okay, question is about the role of private industry in combating cyber terrorism. And the questioner is asking, number one, why are private industries, in your view, reluctant to or unable to respond to cyber terrorism? And two, are the U.S. intelligence agencies going to be capable of dealing with that threat without the assistance of the private sector?
I think the principal reason why they're reluctant to deal with it or to talk about it is purely for competitive reasons. If your bank has been hacked by the Chinese and they admitted that we've been hacked and we can't get to your funds, and the one down the street hasn't said so, you're going to move your money as soon as you can to the bank that hasn't been hacked. The same thing, other organizations that have a competitive advantage or disadvantage against other industries, they're not going to want to admit that they have vulnerabilities. They don't want to attract attention. If you would say we were hacked, you just told every hacker in the world, hey, these guys are vulnerable. Let's see what I can find in there. And so all these kids in their mom's basements suddenly start trying to penetrate the computer systems of whatever it is, General Motors or whatever. So for logical reasons, they try to maintain a very low profile, not talk about it. And so it makes it difficult to, they will share sometimes with the U.S. government, but they will do so only if you won't share that information publicly. And you want to encourage them to tell when they've been penetrated, but you also sometimes have to deal with it publicly. What can the U.S. government help defend them? Sure, they can help defend them. Can they sufficiently defend them? It's a mystery to me. I would like to say yes, but I fear that there will be potential serious attacks on some sectors in the U.S. government. That's just not based on any intelligence. That's just my gut instinct, and it's something that we should all be concerned about.
Before we say thanks to Bill Harlow, let me just remind you about our next program, which is 2 weeks from tonight on Wednesday, March 13th, when we'll meet Rami Khouri, who is a well-known journalist in the Middle East from Jordan and Lebanon, who will assess the American role in the Middle East. So that's 2 weeks from tonight on March 13th. If you don't already receive email announcements of programs like this, there's a bright orange sheet out in the lobby. Please clearly print your email address there, and we'll be happy to keep you aware of these kinds of programs. Now, let's say thanks to Bill Harlow. Thank you for coming to the University of Delaware.